The rain came down in torrents, soaking the cracked concrete of a highway rest stop near Seattle. Headlights cut through the curtain of water, casting trembling beams across the slick pavement. Ethan Cole leaned against his black Range Rover, eyes fixed on a late-night work email glowing on his phone. Wind whipped through his charcoal coat, but he didn't flinch. Ethan was always calm, even when the world around him spun out of control. Then he saw her. At first it was just a pale blur in the rain, like a ghost. A woman in a wedding dress, barefoot, running across the parking lot. Mud clung to her hem, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, hair plastered to her skin. She was drenched, shivering to the bone, and her eyes didn't scream confusion. They screamed desperation. She stopped right in front of him, chest heaving, her stare wild with fear. Before Ethan could speak, she gasped, voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes weren't pleading. They were begging for survival. "Please, take my virginity." Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Maybe he had drunk more wine than he realized during dinner with his clients. The rain poured harder, but the girl looked seconds from collapsing. "I'm serious," she said, trembling. "I'll pay you. Just do it. Tonight." "Did you just escape from an asylum?" Ethan asked, but there was no madness in her eyes. No intoxication, just sheer, raw terror. "If not, I'm as good as dead." Her voice cracked, her hands twisted together like she was holding on to the last shred of hope. Ethan was a man of control, structure, and precision. But this was chaos in a wedding dress. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low. "There's no time. They're coming. Please, just let me in your car. If you won't help, at least let me be anywhere but here." Ethan looked around. No headlights, no pursuers. Just this girl, trembling in the storm like she had nothing left to lose. "What happened?" She closed her eyes. "I was supposed to get married tonight. I couldn't go through with it. I ran." "So you decided to hand your virginity to a stranger at a gas station?" She winced. "I know how it sounds. But if I go back untouched, they'll force the wedding. If I'm not pure, the contract is broken." Ethan looked at her more closely. She couldn't be more than 25. The gown was designer, but her hands were scraped raw. She smelled like fear and rain and something delicate beneath it. Desperation. He sighed and unlocked the car. "Get in before you freeze." She looked at him like he had just saved her life. Maybe in a way, he had. "Clara," she whispered as the car pulled away from the curb. He kept his eyes on the road. He didn't know who she was, didn't know what this night would cost him, but one thing was certain. This wasn't something he could just drive away from. Ethan didn't know who he was bringing home, nor did he fully understand why. But as the car rolled into the underground garage and the elevator doors slid shut behind them, he knew tonight would change everything. Ethan Cole's penthouse crowned the top floor of a glass-walled high-rise in the heart of downtown Seattle. Everything about the space was crisp, minimal, and perfectly controlled, like the man who owned it. Clara sat silently on a leather armchair, wrapped tightly in a thick towel. Her wedding dress hung near the fireplace, dripping its last bits of rainwater onto the polished wooden floor. Soft lighting cast a pale glow on her exhausted face. She watched Ethan, the stranger who'd brought her here without asking too many questions, as he moved through the kitchen with quiet precision. He set a mug of hot cocoa in front of her without a word, then turned toward the window, watching the city shimmer beneath the rain. "Seattle never changes," he said softly. "Even in storms." Clara didn't respond. Her hands still trembled. Ethan realized it wasn't just the cold anymore. It was fear. "I'm not going to do it," he said finally, eyes still on the glass. "I'm not the kind of man who takes advantage of someone in survival mode." She nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I got in your car." Ethan turned and looked at her. "Why me?" "Because you didn't look at me like I was broken. You looked at me like a person." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, he began carefully, "Tell me what's really going on." Clara took a deep breath. "I'm the daughter of Senator Richard Hayes. Today was supposed to be my wedding, but it wasn't about love. It was a contract, a political alliance disguised as vows. The arrangement was made when I was 16. And your virginity was a clause in that contract? Ethan asked, voice tightening. Clara nodded, gaze heavy. They're the kind who believe in purity as reputation. If I'm not a virgin, the deal falls apart. So you ran and came to me to break it? Not just anyone could have said no, she whispered. But you look like someone who could say no to the world. I needed that. Ethan sat across from her, studying her face. He didn't see recklessness. He didn't see foolishness. He saw someone pushed to the edge far too young. What's your plan now? I'm not going back, no matter what. You really think they won't come looking for you? With power like that, they could tear this city apart. They might, Clara said, locking eyes with him. But for the first time in my life, I made a choice. He was quiet for a long beat. Then finally he said, you can stay here, for now, until I figure out if I'm harboring a runaway bride or someone who actually needs saving. Her eyes filled with a cautious hope. Thank you. Don't thank me. This isn't kindness. It's just the only rational thing I could do at 2 a.m. He stood and walked out of the room, leaving her alone in the living space. But for the first time in a long time, Clara didn't feel completely alone. 3 days had passed since Clara walked into Ethan Cole's penthouse in the middle of a storm. 3 days without a single call or threat, yet the air still felt heavy, like the calm before another collapse. Clara rarely left the living room, curling up on the long leather couch beneath the towering windows that looked out over Seattle's mist. She didn't ask for much, didn't complain, didn't touch anything except a book she pulled from the shelf. Ethan remained himself, waking at 6 a.m., black coffee, white shirt pressed to perfection. He didn't waste time on unnecessary words. He didn't ask questions, but he let her stay. One rainy afternoon, Clara stood before the bookshelf, her fingers grazing the spines of old novels. A small picture frame caught her eye. In it, a young boy sat beside a woman with sad eyes and a soft smile. The inscription beneath read, Ethan and Mom, 1997. You enjoy snooping? His voice behind her made Clara flinch. She turned, slightly embarrassed. I just saw the photo. She was my mom, died of cancer when I was 13. I'm sorry. Don't be. Everyone dies. It's just a matter of when. Clara frowned. That's a terrible way to look at life. It's the most realistic. She walked closer, bare feet silent against the cool stone floor. You don't let people in, do you? Ethan looked down at her. Letting people in costs something. I don't like debt. And yet, you let me in. That was a lapse in judgment. Or maybe you saw something in me. Clara tilted her head. Or maybe I just didn't want a dead girl bleeding on my leather seats. Clara let out a soft laugh, the sound surprising even her. Ethan's lips twitched, but he said nothing more. The silence between them was no longer tense. It felt like two people learning how to exist in the same space without slicing open each other's wounds. That night, Ethan came home from a long meeting to find Clara curled up by the window. Her gaze wasn't on the city. It was somewhere deeper, somewhere within herself. You okay? For the first time, his voice softened. I used to think, Clara murmured, if I just lost that part of myself, I'd be free. But now I'm not so sure. Maybe freedom isn't just breaking a rule. Maybe it's breathing without fear. Ethan said nothing at first. Then quietly, he poured her a glass of warm water. They institutionalized my mom for 6 months, Clara said, still staring into the fog. She tried to leave my father once, but he had the power. She didn't. Ethan froze. She never smiled again after that. He sat across from her. I was 15 when my father walked out, left us with debts, lies, and a mother slowly dying. I worked nights, coded during the day. I owe no one anything. And Maha, Clara turned to him. So we both grew up in houses that looked perfect from the outside, but were made of glass. Ethan let out a bitter smile. And glass cuts deep when it shatters. They stared at each other. No more words needed. They weren't close. There were no hollow reassurances, no awkward embraces, but something quiet and real was slowly growing in the silent spaces between them. Ethan didn't ask why Clara stayed up late, Clara didn't question why Ethan always left the kitchen light on, even when no one used it. They didn't share everything, but somehow they understood. Two people used to living in their own cages, now finding air in the same room. One morning, Clara left a cup of black coffee on the kitchen counter before Ethan woke up. No note, no smile, just a small gesture, the kind that says, "I see you," without needing words. The next day, Ethan brought home a rare novel, placing it gently on the table where Clara usually sat. The cover was worn, but the choice was unmistakably intentional. Neither of them mentioned it. They didn't have to. Between two guarded souls, a quiet understanding began to bloom. Not loud, not rushed. Just two wounds slowly recognizing each other, but quiet moments never last forever. As two guarded souls slowly began to trust, the outside world had already started to crack, and the door to Clara's past, no matter how tightly she had sealed it, was about to be blown open. That night, just as Ethan set down his glass of bourbon, his private phone rang. The one no one ever used unless it mattered. He frowned at the screen. No caller ID. Encrypted. He picked up. "Ethan Cole." A pause, then a voice, deep, cold, and carved with power, filled the silence. "You're harboring my daughter." Ethan knew instantly who it was, not because they'd met, but because he'd heard that voice in countless televised speeches. Commanding, absolute, with no room for refusal. "Senator Hayes," Ethan said slowly, "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "No need. I just need you to understand one thing. I want my daughter back. Now. She's not a possession you can order back. She is part of an agreement between two families, and you, Cole, are standing between a transaction worth more than everything you've ever built." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his voice steady. "You really think a threat will make me hand her over like a misdelivered package? It's not a threat, it's a promise. Refuse, and I'll escalate, in ways you won't enjoy." "Try me," Ethan said, then hung up. The challenging statement led to a more explosive event. The next morning, chaos erupted. Media outlets broadcast images of a young woman in an oversized white t-shirt standing by the penthouse window. Her face blurred, but anyone familiar with the Hayes wedding could recognize that silhouette. Clara Hayes had vanished, and now she was with a stranger. One gossip blog struck first. Runaway bride senator's daughter Clara Hayes missing. Connection to architect tycoon Ethan Cole. 3 hours later, shares in Cole Design Studio dipped. 5 hours later, an anonymous internal source emailed regulators, accusing the firm of professional misconduct. By nightfall, paparazzi swarmed the street outside the building. Clara sat in the corner of the room, knees pulled to her chest, eyes locked on the glowing TV screen. "I ruined everything," she whispered. "Everything's unraveling, and it's my fault." Ethan sat across from her, not a trace of blame in his expression. "Clara," she looked away. "If I leave now, maybe it stops. The press will move on. He'll stop pushing if you're no longer protecting me." He stood, walked to her, and sat down at her level. "You think I care about any of that? Headlines, stock prices, reputation? What about your company? Everything you've built for over a decade? It can be rebuilt, but I can't recreate this moment. You sitting here thinking you're a burden?" She was speechless. He rested a hand on the table, voice low and firm. "I choose you." Clara looked at him, her eyes glassy. "You won't be the only one paying for that choice. Then we'll pay together." A deep breath settled between them. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like she needed to run. No more hiding behind glass. No more apologizing for being. And Ethan, for the first time in years, realized that control, the thing he had always clung to, was nothing compared to the need to protect someone who had never truly been protected. They were no longer running, but that didn't mean the world would stop chasing. And this time, Ethan knew silence was no longer an option if he wanted to protect Clara. 2 days after the call from Senator Hayes, Ethan made his move. His once private studio, usually reserved for quiet design meetings, had turned into a press battlefield. Over 30 reporters crammed into the front entrance, cameras flashing, mics raised. Clara stood in a small room behind the stage, watching through a crack in the door, her hands clenched tight. She wasn't built for this world, where every gaze cut like a knife. But this time, she wasn't hiding. Ethan stepped onto the platform. Black suit, steady eyes. He didn't hold a speech, didn't need one. He knew exactly what had to be said. Every camera turned to him. "Thank you for coming," Ethan began. His voice was calm, clear. "Let me get straight to the point." The room fell silent. There have been rumors circulating about a woman seen at my residence, about our relationship, about who she is, and why she's there. A beat. Then he looked directly into the cameras. "Her name is Clara Hayes. Yes, the daughter of Senator Richard Hayes. And no, she's not a secret mistress, not a PR stunt, not a setup." His tone sharpened. "She is someone I chose to protect. Akram." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Reporters sat up straighter, lenses focused in. Clara fled a forced marriage, a political agreement disguised as a wedding, signed in honor, legacy, and her own body. I cannot and will not stand by while a woman is treated as property in a game of power. He placed a hand firmly on the podium, unwavering. "I don't care who feels threatened. I don't care what reputations crack. I care about one thing, that Clara deserves a life she chooses, not one chosen for her." A voice from the front asked, "You're aware she was part of a political alliance? You know what you're disrupting?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "I know, and I choose to disrupt it." Another question followed. "Aren't you afraid of lawsuits, contracts lost, your reputation destroyed?" Ethan gave a dry smile. "I built everything from nothing. If I have to, I'll do it again. But I can't rebuild my conscience if I let someone I care about live like a prisoner." That made the room pause. "So," a female reporter asked softly, "you're saying you love her?" Ethan met the camera. "Yes, and this time I'm not keeping it behind closed doors." Behind the door, Clara let go of the frame. Her heart pounded, not in fear, but because she had never heard anyone say something like that for her. Out loud, to the world. No one, until today. When the press conference ended, the internet exploded. Half praised Ethan as a man of conviction. The other half accused him of staging drama for fame. Ethan gave no follow-up interviews, no statements, no social media replies. He simply went home and found Clara waiting in the kitchen. No fear in her eyes this time. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "More sure than anything I've ever designed." She smiled when, and for the first time since it all began, the smile wasn't hiding behind anything. After the press conference, Clara's name was no longer tied to Runaway or Scandal. Social media exploded with hashtags like the leather shoes and Free Clara. Young women, survivors of forced marriages, those once silenced by family expectations, those who never dared to say no, they started telling their stories. From India, from the Middle East, from suburban America. They called Clara the one who lit the first spark. Not because she led a revolution, but because she walked away. She broke a rule designed to control her, and she let someone stand beside her in doing so. She didn't give speeches. She didn't do interviews. But the image of her standing just behind the stage during the conference, eyes lifted, no longer afraid, went viral. Clara Hayes, once a girl forced to live by someone else's script, had become a symbol of the right to choose her own life. In the days after the press conference, Clara no longer hid in corners. She opened the windows, letting light in. She made coffee in the mornings, for both of them. And sometimes she hummed, softly without words, while rearranging the books on the shelf. Ethan never said anything about it, but he often paused when walking by, just to listen. Clara wasn't the trembling girl from that stormy night anymore. Still her, but with brighter eyes, lighter steps, and something in her gaze Ethan couldn't ignore. Life. One late night, as the city outside fell silent, Clara sat beside Ethan on the long sofa, wrapped in a thin blanket. He was reviewing sketches, eyes on the screen, but he knew she was watching him. "Ethan," she said quietly. He closed the laptop. "Yeah? I came to you, out of fear." He didn't answer. "But what if I choose you now?" she continued. "Not because I'm afraid, but because I want to." It wasn't a proposal. It was a truth finally finding air. Ethan looked at her for a long time, long enough that her heart started to race. "I don't do things just because someone's vulnerable," he said slowly. "That's not who I am." "I know." Clara tightened her grip on the blanket. "But I'm not vulnerable anymore." He exhaled deeply, then moved closer, not rushing, not invading. "Then tell me what you really want." She met his eyes. "I want to feel something real, without guilt, without pressure. I want to touch someone and not feel like I'm being used to buy peace." He lifted his hand halfway, waiting. She nodded. His hand touched her cheek, gently, with no urgency. Just presence, warmth, certainty. Their first kiss wasn't cinematic. It wasn't fiery or fast. It was slow, honest, and deep enough that Clara closed her eyes. Not in fear, but in trust. And when silence finally became safe between them, they didn't need words to understand. So they moved, not toward passion, but towards something far braver. Trust. Just two people who had once broken, now trying not to hurt each other again. No boundaries were rushed, only walls slowly falling. And when Clara woke the next morning, nothing had changed. Ethan was sitting by the window, coffee in hand. But when she approached, hair tousled, shirt oversized, he looked at her like she was the first light of the day. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, smiling. "For the first time in years, I don't feel like a pawn in someone else's game." Ethan set the cup down. "You were never a pawn, Clara. You just hadn't been given the chance to be a player." She stepped closer, resting her head on his shoulder. No words needed, because the truth was, last night wasn't just their first physical closeness. It was the first time they truly let someone see them. Unguarded, whole, and real. But the past, no matter how quiet the present felt, never forgets. Just when they began to believe things were finally settling, the past found its way back in. This time, it didn't need noise to be terrifying. Just a white envelope, quietly slipped beneath the door. That morning began like any other. Clara woke up first, brewed coffee, and left a mug on the windowsill for Ethan. He was still asleep, and she smiled at the softness on his face in the early light. Everything felt so calm she almost believed. Maybe it's finally over. Until she found the letter, a plain white envelope, no name, no stamp, no return address, slid beneath the door like a whisper no one heard. Clara hesitated before opening it. The paper was thick. A faint scent of expensive cologne clung to it. Inside, a single sentence typed in cold uniform font. "You may run to him, but you still belong to me." Her hands trembled, not from shock, but recognition. Her father didn't need to scream, didn't need headlines or threats. This was his reminder. He was watching, still in control. Ethan saw the letter as he entered the kitchen. Clara's face was blank. He took the paper from her without asking, read it once, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash. "So now he plays dirty," he muttered. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like steel. "He won't stop," Clara whispered. "To him, people are nothing next to power." Ethan nodded. "Then neither will I." 3 days later, Ethan released a full dossier through his firm's official platform. No press, no drama, just a link. And it was enough to shake the very political foundations behind the arranged marriage. The file included a scanned marriage contract between the Hayes and Sutton families, part of a strategic alliance in an upcoming election. One clause stated, Clara's purity must be intact, or the family would forfeit funding and media protection. Attached were internal documents, private meeting notes, and emails demanding Clara stay silent and obey, with veiled threats against her mother's well-being. But most powerful was Ethan's statement. "This isn't revenge. This is accountability. I refuse to stay silent while women like Clara are treated like commodities. Civilization means nothing if we're still shackled by golden chains." The internet exploded. Survivors of forced marriages began telling their stories. Activist groups took notice. Some called Ethan's move professional suicide. Others called it the bravest thing they'd seen in years. Clara read it all in silence. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. "You didn't have to do this," she said as Ethan entered the room. "I know. And you still did. Because no one else would." She looked at him for a long time, then whispered, "I thought I was just a crack in your perfect life." Ethan stepped closer, took her hand. "No, Clara. You're the reason I started building something real." Clara couldn't remember everything social media said about her, about the girl who challenged tradition, the survivor turned symbol, or the voice of a new generation. They were all true, but none of them felt quite complete. Because the one thing she felt most clearly after that day was relief. Not because her father had backed off, not because the media had changed its tone, but because, for the first time, someone had dared to name her pain. Publicly, without shame, without watering it down to save face. Ethan hadn't just protected her. He had allowed the world to see her as a whole person, not a bargaining chip, not a background character. Clara no longer needed to whisper, no longer needed permission to be free. That evening, she stepped out onto the balcony at sunset. The city buzzed beneath her, but inside her, a rare quiet had settled. Ethan stood behind her, silent as always. She didn't turn around, just whispered, "Thank you. Not just for choosing me, but for letting me choose myself." He didn't answer, but his hand found hers, not to save, just to stay. That evening, Clara sat alone on the balcony, her tea growing cold in her hands. She didn't cry. She had cried through fear, shame, and all the nights she wanted to disappear. But tonight, the tears in her eyes came from something rarer: being moved. Ethan wasn't the first person to shield her, but he was the first to not hide her behind him, but instead stand beside her. In the light, in the storm, in full view of the world. He didn't protect her as a victim. He acknowledged her as a person. And to Clara, that was more than love. It was recognition, something she had never truly received, not even from her own family. She looked down at the street below. Life was still rushing by, but inside her, something had finally quieted. A small space had been cleared, just enough to begin again. From herself. Tomorrow they wouldn't need to fight anymore. They would begin learning how to live, not as fugitives, but as two people building something of their own. 3 months after the press conference, the city had moved on to newer scandals. News outlets chased fresh controversies. Clara Hayes' name no longer trended online, and she didn't need it to. On a quiet corner in Fremont, Seattle, a small bookshop with crystal-clear glass windows had just opened. Hand-painted on a wooden sign outside were the words, "The Quiet Chapter," books, coffee, and quiet dreams. Inside, Clara adjusted a tiny vase on the corner table. No silk gowns, no headlines. Just her, in a linen apron, hair tied back, eyes calm like the pages of an old book. She had once lived a scripted life. Now her mornings began with the scent of fresh coffee and the sound of stories unfolding. That was freedom. As for Ethan, his company had trembled under accusations and media backlash surrounding Clara. But surprisingly, he lost nothing. In fact, he gained what money couldn't buy. Blackwell Ventures, the empire he built, began to rise stronger than before. Investors returned, drawn by integrity. Ethan was no longer the cold man of finance. He was the man who had said no to old power and survived it. But to Ethan, the greatest success didn't appear on any list. It stood behind the counter of a small bookstore, handing him a mug and asking, "What'll you have today?" One late autumn evening, after the last customer had left and the lights had dimmed, Clara was wiping cups when Ethan walked in. No fanfare, no surprises, just him, holding a small velvet box. "Do you remember the first time you told me you wanted to feel chosen, not forced?" he began. His voice was steady, low. Clara nodded. Her heart skipped. "I've been choosing you since that night in the rain, but today I want to ask this. Not for the past, not to prove anything, but for our future." He opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, thin, understated, but quietly stunning. "I don't want to own you. I don't want to save you. I just want to choose you every single day, if you'll let me." Clara didn't speak at first. Then she set down the towel, stepped closer, and took his trembling hand in hers. "I'll let you," she whispered, "and I'll choose you too. Every day." No audience, just shelves of stories, the scent of baked goods, and the soft sound of a new chapter quietly beginning. Clara didn't need a grand ceremony or vows shouted into the air. All she needed was that look, the one that had chosen her in her worst moment and still chose her now, when peace had finally returned. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing she knew, clearer than ever: real love isn't a destination. It's a choice made again and again, every single day. 3 months after Ethan's quiet proposal, the world had moved on. The crisis that once dominated headlines had faded into little more than a faint line in the archives. But one thing hadn't faded: their love. Clara didn't return to the glittering world she once belonged to. She chose to live slowly, honestly, and with purpose. Her book and coffee shop became more than a storefront. It became a quiet refuge for readers, for wanderers, for those who had once been controlled, boxed in, or told they weren't enough. They came not for advice, but to find pieces of themselves in the stories Clara had written, lived, and survived. No spotlight, no performance, just a woman who chose freedom every day and inspired others to do the same. As for Ethan, the man once called cold had shed the armor he had worn for so long. He hadn't changed who he was. He had simply remembered who he could be. He still ran his company, but he no longer worked himself into exhaustion. He knew now what mattered most. And sometimes the most valuable thing wasn't a quarterly report, but a cup of coffee made just right, or the quiet way Clara looked at him while they read in silence. Tonight they sat on the rooftop of the old building, the same one that had once witnessed both their chaos and their beginning. The sky above glittered with stars. The breeze carried the scent of poplars, mixed with the faint trace of vanilla from Clara's tea. She leaned her head on his shoulder and asked softly, "Do you think this will last?" Ethan paused, then turned to her. "No grand speeches, no lofty promises. It already has, because anything real doesn't need to shout. It just stays." Because to him, lasting wasn't measured in years or milestones. It was found in this, the quiet choosing, after everything had fallen apart, and still choosing again. They understood something now. Love wasn't a place to hide from the world. It was a safe place, where two people could be fully themselves, could heal, could be seen, where one saw the other's broken pieces and didn't try to fix them, just held them gently. Real love is a choice, not a destination. And most of all, it's a choice made every single day.